Hi, everybody. This is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute. I want to thank you for joining us today for a conversation about clergy abuse with Mary Dispenza and Reverend James Evinger. Before we get started, I want to go over a couple of technical issues. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see this slide on your screen. If you're having problems with your sound or things are acting odd, I would suggest you log out of the webinar and then reconnect using the link in your email. Also, we would love to hear from you. So if you have questions, please submit them using the question box, and I will kind of edge them into the conversation as we go along. And let's see, here are our presenters today. So Mary Dispenza is a former nun, and she is an advocate of those abused by priests. She has written a wonderful memoir called Split, and we'll have a link to her website, and you can take a look at the book cover at the end of the presentation. She's the Northwest Director of SNAP, and she serves on the SNAP National Board of Directors. And then Reverend James Evinger is an ordained minister in the Presbyterian Church of USA, and he has had numerous research appointments at the University of Rochester Medical Center, has taught medical ethics and many other things, and he's a respected trainer and presenter. He's written extensively and consulted on sexual boundary violations in faith communities. And he is also the person who has created and maintained the Clergy Sexual Abuse Bibliography, which is a massive work that is ongoing and a tremendous resource. So we'll also have links to that at the end of the presentation. We want to thank our sponsor today, the In Faith Community Foundation, and they are a huge friend to our organization, and we do lots of work with them, so we thank them for sponsoring today's webinar. So let's get started. Mary, you were just in Rome at the Big Vatican Conference. How was that?
That was amazing in many, many, many ways. You asked a question of us, how did we get to where we are? Well, when I was in Rome and standing in front of that magnificent edifice, St. Peter's Basilica, I asked myself, how in the world did I get here? And I added, maybe all roads do lead to Rome. But it was a very, a moment that was mixed with different emotions. There was the pain and loss and suffering of clergy abuse in my own life and nun abuse, coupled with this magnificence of and splendor of the Catholic Church when it's functioning at its best, which very often it is not. But the emotions were just spilling in and out of me. I had the honor of attending a pre-summit with 10 representatives of clergy abuse from around the world. And we met with Cardinal Cicluna and Supich. And I can tell you the session was hot and heavy. And the first question raised was, where is the Pope? Why is Francis not here? If this is so important and we're so important, where is Francis? It was like, where is Waldo? And it was a hot and heavy exchange. Hopefully some of what we said got back to the summit. We really don't know that. And of course, just briefly, the outcome for me was very disappointing. I could go on about that, but I don't know how much you would like right now about that. And
well, yeah, I mean, tell us what your expectations were, what your hopes were, and then kind of what you think the outcome was.
Well, my expectations, I wanted some action. I wanted the summit to end with, we will we are going to do X, Y, and Z. But really, the outcome of those days were preventative measures. They went from a better training for seminarians, a handbook for seminarians, the feeling that now all the bishops knew about clergy abuse, which I say, what? They did not know that this is a significant problem around the world and that children, young people, men, women are being raped daily. So to me, that wasn't much of an outcome. It was preventative measures and about the future. There was no addressing about the past and what we're going to do to change it. I wanted to hear things like zero tolerance. We said we would do that back at the Dallas chapter 15 years ago. We haven't done it, and we want to tell the people of God we are ready to do that. And I wanted them to say we will begin immediately to dismiss any predators that are still in ministry. And believe it or not, there are. And bishops too, who are still covering up. I wanted to hear that all priests and people in ministry would be mandated reporters, and they're not. And well, on and on. So I was disappointed, didn't hear concrete actions that would keep children any safer than when it started.
Yeah, I read recently, the Pew just put out a research report on Catholics' sense of the church in the wake of the clergy abuse scandals and ongoing scandals. And so many of them seem to suggest that it was all in the past, like we have dealt with this and moved forward. It's
and I read recently in a Pew research report that most Catholics believe it is still existing.
Yeah.
And I was happy to hear that, because it is.
Absolutely.
And why the church is so resistant to report crimes externally to the criminal justice system or to AGs is beyond my understanding. Crimes are crimes, and they deserve to be persecuted by law. And still, even in the bishops' conference, U.S. bishops' conference, still that they continue to think that they can handle all of this internally and police and monitor themselves, but they can't. It's absolutely ridiculous to think that we will tell on each other. Priests will tell bishops, bishops will tell each other, and somehow that's going to solve the problem. I don't even understand how the church, the hierarchy, can maintain that position. It's failed for decades, and it's still failing as a way of getting to the truth and justice and serving survivors in their best interest.
Yeah, absolutely. So Jim, how did you get involved with this work?
I've had time to think about your question, Sarah, which I appreciate. I think growing up in the 60s for me was where I learned to really listen to where the pain is, to go where the suffering is in terms of whatever the nature of the victimization. Certainly civil rights, and then the intrusion of the Vietnam War, which took over attention to that movement at the national level. When I graduated from seminary in the 70s, I was working in a blue-collar neighborhood congregation in Philadelphia, and a young woman in the congregation was raped twice, 2 different occasions, violently and at gunpoint. And because of the dynamics at that time, the understanding of rape, she was the person who was held responsible by family and friends. The internalized shame was just absolutely stigmatizing. I had been reading Susan Brown Miller's classic book, Against Our Will, which had a totally different understanding of the nature of rape, an act of violence, not as a sexual act. There was a wonderful group in Philadelphia called WAR, Women Against Rape. So I put her in touch with that group. She began working through the issues. She had people with whom she could process that. She came back to me and started dealing with the theological questions. Where is God in all this? Profound spiritual issues. And when she got to the point where she was ready, then what we did was we worked with people within that congregation, a select group of women, and started bringing in speakers to address what is the nature of rape. How do you understand it? What does that do to people? How do you prevent it? What resources were available? And as I reflect on that, that really became the template for me. I started meeting women who were dealing with alcohol abuse or substance abuse, and just beginning to peel the layers of what was going on. What are the issues beneath that? If that's a way of numbing the pain, where is that pain originating? And I began hearing stories of childhood sexual abuse, domestic partner abuse. So then in 1995, our denomination began, due to changes in national church law, we began holding clergy offenders accountable. At that time, the primary model, which was reflected in Marie Fortune's book, Is Nothing Sacred, it was male clergy exploiting female parishioners and counselees. And because of my clinical involvement, I got asked to chair a disciplinary committee. We asked Marie to testify as an expert witness. And as she was being driven back to the airport, one of the folks said, "Marie, you seem nervous. What was that all about? We expected you to be this strong, confident person." She said, "I've never had a denominational group be willing to go to the wall to hold somebody accountable," which was a horrible commentary. But because of that positive outcome and because of how carefully we approached establishing what happened, word of mouth. And so pretty soon I began getting invitations. How did you do this? What worked? What didn't work? It was word of mouth. People who are looking for resources in this context of sexual boundary violations in faith communities, they'll find people. It's been humbling, and I knew that eventually we would start dealing with child sexual abuse. Once you start holding the male exploiters accountable for their work with adults, after a while it's going to make it safe for the males to come forward. We saw that happen. And once we laid down that kind of capacity to make it safe for those folks, then we started getting more and more reports of child sexual abuse.
Yeah. So one of the things I was hoping you would both speak to is kind of taking a few minutes to reflect on the current situation. Because as we were saying before we started the webinar, there is an explosion of information and activism, and you can't open the paper without seeing several stories about the Catholic Church, the Southern Baptist Conference. I mean, there's just stuff going on all the time. So if you would just, because you have some historical perspective, and I think that's helpful for people who maybe are kind of new to the conversation. What do you think about where we are and where we've come from? And Mary, you want to start?
Well, you know, even in my own life, I think of where I was and where I am now in my own theology and faith life even. But when I thought about this, I came to three points. Change in the Catholic Church, it's really a time of change. There, for every one person that is joining the Catholic Church, research says 6 are leaving. So it's a time when people are leaving the church, and that presents a problem, of course, to the communities and to the hierarchy. It's a change in that more and more of us are living within a culture and a time that by its very nature is changing. We have the issue of abortion, the marriage issue in the Catholic Church, which says if your second marriage hasn't been annulled, you're not welcome at the altar and to receive the Eucharist. And there are all these changes that the culture is moving with, but the church is not moving. And that is a big challenge for the Catholic Church to take the traditions and values and past, but move it into the culture of today. And if that's not done, I'm not one to predict, but I'll say I predict the Catholic Church will continue to lose its followers because the church is not speaking to them anymore. We're at this time. And the other, for the Catholic Church, I think it's a pay-up time. It's really time for them to put their arms around this piece of secrecy and silence and cover-up in the Catholic Church regarding clergy abuse. And I believe until they do that, they cannot be the church they're called to be. And for me, that would be what I stated early, facing the past, telling us how it happened and what you're going to do to stop it and do it. So it's a time that calls for action on their part. In the last thing that comes to my mind, it's an opportunity time for the Catholic Church. For me, it's a make or break time. There's that passage in scripture that says, make straight the way of the Lord. It is time to make straight, to make right. There is the other scriptural piece that says that before you give me your gifts, go and settle up. Go make right with everyone. And both of these mandates from scripture are tell the hierarchy, the ministry, what they need to do. Make straight the way of the Lord, settle up. Don't come giving me your gifts until you have first made it right with your neighbor. So I think it's a time of change, a pay up time, and a time of opportunity.
So, Jim, I know that we were talking about before the webinar started how challenging it must be to keep the bibliography on clergy sexual abuse updated, given everything that's happening these days. You want to give us some thoughts about where we're at?
Sure, but first let me just say, preach it, sister, preach it.
You can get the nun out of the convent, but no, what is it? You can get the convent out of the nun, but no, you know what I mean. You can't get the nun out of the, oh well.
Yeah.
You got it.
I think what's interesting, I come from a denomination that does not have bishops. We do not have a formal hierarchy in that sociological sense that, say, the Roman Catholic Church does, or that Lutherans, Methodists, Episcopalians do. So I often end up dealing with these traditions where it's either muddier as to who you hold accountable, or more lately, traditions which have been basically of minority status in this country. So I'm thinking of, I've been involved as an expert witness in 5 civil suits where the plaintiff, the person who had been victimized, could not get any kind of decent response at all from the particular religious community. That's when they turned to lawyers, not to seek money, but to seek justice. Like Mary says, let the church be the church. What's been really interesting in those situations is dealing with that particular religious body's defense attorneys. These folks, they're insular, they feel that they're going to be punished by the broader culture if they reveal their dirty laundry. And if you look at past histories in this nation in terms of religious discrimination, there's a lot of truth to that. Where the encouraging sign, though, is emerging is it's with the survivors themselves, particularly those of women who are going outside their tradition. One of the things that I've been doing for about 5 years, I joined a local group. I'm in Rochester, New York. We have serious poverty rates in this city, particularly child poverty. And there's an amazing group locally, RACAN, Rochester Area Child Abuse Network. They work with African American congregations, and those are primarily inner city congregations. So I come in with this background, religious background, of dealing with folks who talk about policies, church law, and that kind of a thing. And I discover that working with some of the storefront congregations, the whole notion of having a policy or a church constitution that would address anything like this just is not there. So then how do these things get taught? How do these dimensions of accountability, how does that work? And what I discovered is what I call a relational oriented approach as opposed to a rule oriented approach. Mary referred to the Dallas Charter. That lays out some very explicit norms. I discovered folks who work on the basis of one anothering each other, holding each other accountable at a very personal level. And I find that very encouraging, that within each particular tradition or within each culture, its survivors, by raising their voices and mobilizing with others, are discovering effective ways to do that. So historically, the Southern Baptists have said we don't have the kind of table of organization where we can do these kinds of things. Well, they're figuring out how they're going to do it because they have been pushed to the limit.
Right.
That trend I see happening in some of these more marginalized groups around the country.
Wow. That's hopeful. That's great. I mean, one of the things that I was hoping you would speak to is that the survivors are the people who are taking these issues on and carrying the load of making change in institutions and congregations. And I think it's important for those of us who are allies to take some of that burden. So do you have any suggestions or thoughts about how allies can support survivors in these movements? Because it's been a lot of work.
Well, I wondered if I could back up a little bit. Some things that Jim shared just now made me think of those abused by nuns for some reason. And since the Pennsylvania investigation, I, as the contact person for Nun Abuse for SNAP, have received about 65 calls from survivors who have been abused by nuns. And in a way, I think they're the forgotten ones. They're just beginning, and it connects to your question, they are just beginning to find their voice and to say, me too, and don't forget us. And their stories are horrendous. And I know because I was a nun, and not just that, but experienced their goodness. I know the goodness of the nuns. But it does not mean that there are no nun perpetrators. So again, it will be because of survivors coming forward, giving their voice, giving their story, giving their pain and suffering to the world, so that those of us who care will act up in a good sense and say, number one, these strong, brave men and women need justice, and they need it in whatever way they want. If they want to talk to the religious order and negotiate, then religious communities need to welcome, open, listen, and cooperate. If they want to go the legal path, I hope someday they have the opportunity. Because after the Pennsylvania study, there were 1,000 survivors and I believe 300 perpetrators. Out of those 1,000 survivors, I think 2 could move forward to justice. Now that's something we should pay attention to. What about the thousands who presently have no recourse? I would like to see that window of opportunity we talked about, where survivors, all survivors of childhood abuse, could come forward in a 2-year window of time, plead their case, and receive the justice they deserve. And going back to your question, it's only been survivors and people who care that have made the differences, especially in the Catholic Church. I can know that for sure. Without the survivor's voice, I don't know how far along this spectrum the Catholic Church would be right now.
Yeah, absolutely.
I will endorse that 100% what you're saying, Mary. When I start getting involved with somebody who comes forward as a survivor, the very first question that I start asking after hearing their story, listening is always the first step, but then the next question I ask is, what are you looking for? I think one of the problems that allies face, particularly if they have some kind of position or status within a faith community, I think allies think that there is one particular way to pursue this. So somebody comes forward, discloses a story, they may not be ready at all to go through the very difficult and very challenging process of presenting a formal accusation and trying to implement that accountability, internal accountability process.
Right.
One of the things that I've developed is it's a survivor's wheel of options. This just basically takes what was created by folks in Minneapolis for domestic violence survivors and replicates that for their situation. It takes time for people to figure out where they are. And where they are this month is not going to necessarily be where they are the next month. So the role of allies, I think, is rather than say, okay, you've got to file a formal complaint, here's the form that you need to fill out, you will be called upon as a witness. That's premature. I say to those folks, you look at every nail from the perspective of being a hammer. Well, people who come forward are not all alike.
Right.
It depends on their support, depends on their experience, it depends on their history. depends on the nature of how the abuse occurred.
Right.
So to give people options and time, I think that's where allies have got to start figuring out. People need options.
Mm-hmm. And they need to feel they have options. And that in itself empowers us as survivors, knowing that there are options and I will find my way. We have a support group for non-abuse now. We've met just 2 times, but at the last session, we ended up with the question that you just posed, Jim, to ask each of ourselves, what do we want? And what in our wildest, best dreams, what would we like to see for ourselves? So hopefully when we come together next month, we'll be able to hear each other's stories and offer support. But there isn't any one way. There is, as we know, our way. And finding that takes time and courage. And many survivors have said to me, I'm ready now to talk, or I'm ready now to do that interview. So finding our voices, which we usually lose. Domestic violence survivors, all survivors of sexual abuse often lose their voice, and it takes time to get that back.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one of the things that survivor stories has taught us is that we're now recognizing this as a systemic problem, right? It's not individuals are impacted, but it is a systemic problem. And I also think that's one way that allies can assist, is really helping to take on the systemic issues, the institutional issues. Over and over again, we see institutions and congregations protecting themselves, the lack of transparency, it's like the rule book comes out and everybody's got the same book, and it's, deny, cover up, hide. So what resources do you see for kind of taking on some of these systemic issues, for greater transparency?
Well, for sure, the media. I have appreciated the work the media has done in exposing the problem and showing the world that it isn't just one priest, one bishop. It is a systemic issue. And breaking that apart is a challenge. But I do believe we're beginning to see the scope of the problem. We, meaning Catholics in general. And that's like the first step, increasing awareness that this is not a small problem. This is a global issue. And we're only talking about the United States more or less right now, but around the world in underprivileged communities, the church has taken terrible advantage of indigenous people and impoverished people. So I'm not quite answering your question of how to explain it, pull it apart. Jim, do you have a thought?
It's a real challenge. It really is, because I think one of the things you're alluding to, Sarah, is that it's a culture. It's not just structure. It's also a culture. It's a mindset. I'll go back to Marie. She, in her analyses, she would come time and again to the whole notion of patriarchy, which certainly that's a gendered thing, but then you combine that with what the Catholics have so beautifully taught us about clericalism, the empowered role of clergy, which is a counterpoint to the disempowered role of lay people. It's structure and culture. It's an attitude. It's patterns. So I think the very first thing is to listen to the survivors, because the survivors can name the issues in some profound ways. The next thing I think is just to accept that this is going to require struggle. Bearing witness is going to involve conflict, if not with the religious denomination, then perhaps within one's own family or one's own peers within a congregation. And so to find ways to sustain oneself for the struggle is going to be really important. I like the story in the New Testament about the pool by the gates to Jerusalem, where it's only when the angel troubles the waters of the pool that people with physical infirmities are able to find healing. They have to get into the disrupted waters. And it's the survivors who are the angels troubling the waters. Yeah. The old spiritual, wade in the water, children, wade in the water. It's only when the water is disturbed that the healing is going to come. I think also simply mobilizing other lay people is a tremendous advantage. Peer-based groups, like Mary has been describing, that is an entity in itself, as well as a source of personal support. One of the things that I think is a latent potential within faith communities that has not been well developed is collaborating with what I call the evidence-based providers. So for example, the whole model in this country now of child advocacy centers who are working with children who have been sexually abused. Those folks have got it down. They involve law enforcement, the prosecutors, the police, they involve clinicians, they involve the medical folks. It's a one-stop model. It's a one-stop place of services for a child who's been abused and family members. And in my work, I'm just astounded at how few people in congregations are aware of child advocacy centers in their local community. These are the folks who are talking about trauma-informed care, and not that many congregations are exposed to that. Those, I think, are the kinds of systemic ways to take advantage of resources that are already out there that will lead to more effective efforts. But it's going to be a struggle.
Yes, and wouldn't it have been something if at the summit in Rome, all those groups you just named were part of it? So the conversation doesn't always just stay with the College of Bishops, so to speak, but brings in the other voices, because you can never change it. What did Einstein said something like, we can't solve today's problems with yesterday's minds or something like that. But bringing in more voices to the conversation, I'm speaking mostly on behalf of the Catholic Church now. And I liked what you said about clericalism, and I wanted to mention that when we were talking about culture, because in the Catholic Church, it is changing in that we're tired of the clericalism. We're tired of Father knows best. Father doesn't know best. Father knows some things, but so do the rest of us. And that's where change is beginning to happen right now with lay groups, especially in the Catholic Church, where they're just saying, hey, we are the church and we're going to do something about it. And we want to save it, and we want it to be the church that it can be. So I just want to concur with you and say, yes, it's a systemic change that needs to be addressed from outside, as it has been in many ways, and inside. And there is a book, I just mentioned it, it's in the closet of the Vatican. and it gets different reviews. But I have really, it's been an eye opener for me because it touches on the struggle within the hierarchy of the church, the traditionalists and the conservatives and the radicals, and how getting any new idea or an idea that I would believe is in the best interest of survivors and the Catholic Church to go forward, it's near impossible at times because of their own inside differences, so that this is systemic change there that has to happen too.
Well, let me ask you your opinion on the Australian investigation. So it was undertaken by the government of Australia into child abuse in religious institutions, but also other institutions. And it was a massive undertaking. They spoke with thousands of survivors. And basically, it seems like they're using it to guide the way forward. And I know that there has been some talk of wanting to do something like that in the United States. What do you think about that? Anyone? Jim?
Of the reading that I've been doing, I say the last 3, 4, 5 years, I have been extremely encouraged, just extremely encouraged by the kinds of government inquiries that are coming out of particularly Australia, but also some of the European countries. The system of government is totally different than the US. In the US, we don't have too many choices. You either go to your faith community, and if you're not happy with that response, then you go to a lawyer. Who knows where all these states' attorney generals' reports will go. But one of the exciting things to me about, and I'll use the example of the Australian Commission, they have been identifying 4 kinds of truth. These are publicly funded inquiries, but they're using multidisciplinary teams. They are working directly with survivors, but they have the power to get records, to get the kind of information that we see only when an attorney general or a prosecutor starts subpoenaing records, that kind of a thing. I'm looking at my notes so I get this accurate. Australian Commission was talking about 4 kinds of truth. The first one is what we would recognize in this country as forensic truth, verifiable facts and objective information. That kind of data, that kind of story is important, but it's not the only one. The second kind of truth that they have been embracing, personal or narrative truth, the telling of one's story and the validation of individual subjective experiences of people who had previously been silenced or voiceless. Mary talked earlier about finding one's voice, getting the story out there and having it heard and recognized. We put that outside our legal and governmental system. We devalue it in that regard. A third form, social or dialogue truth, the process of collectively talking about the past and affirming human dignity. So I wasn't there in Rome with Mary, but I assume that that kind of a social dialogue or a public dialogue in which groups of people would be talking with each other and trying to understand each other's narrative. That is just a form of truth that we do not embrace in this country. Mm-hmm. The fourth one is healing and restorative truth, the full and public acknowledgement of a person's human dignity which places facts and their meaning in the context of human relationships. So the legal system in this country is offender-oriented. It's rule-oriented. The burden is to prove that this person did X, Y, Z. What that does is it pushes all the energy toward the offender, and it pushes it away from the person who is abused. So to capture that healing and restorative truth, how did this affect you? What were the consequences to your life over time? What would healing, what would recovery look like to you? That is another form of truth that we need to start valuing. And these Australian and European forms of public inquiries and public reports, which lead to recommendations for changes in policy, regulation, and law, it's very hopeful.
Mary, any thoughts?
Well, that was beautiful, beautifully said. I don't know that I could add much to it. I think the independent investigations are our effort. And of course, all that Jim added, the totality of the Australian approach, even taking some pieces from it and integrating those into what we're trying to do now, would be most helpful. But it also makes me think a little bit about Cardinal Pell right now, who's been back and forth from Rome to Australia. And the recent update is he's appealed. And I've listened to the survivors' stories and accusations, and it'd be very hard to discredit them and not believe them. And so to think that Cardinal Pell would appeal and most likely have some support around that from higher ups in the Catholic Church is appalling to me. And I don't understand things like that.
Yeah. I mean, one of the things that Faith Trust has, because of Marie Fortune, of course, is a book on responding to clergy misconduct. It's kind of a handbook for congregations. And what she really lays out is so many congregations, when they're faced with survivors coming forward, take a very legalistic and protective, institutional protection attitude. And I think what Jim is talking about with the Australian and the European commissions is there's no reason that congregations can't institute practices that take into account, instead of a legalistic approach of black, white, yes, no, don't take into account the stories of survivors, the impact on the community, because that's another thing that we were going to talk about is the impact on congregations when these things happen. I mean, there are individuals who are harmed and traumatized, but congregations are also traumatized. So I just think that there are some important things that institutions can take into. We don't have to keep doing it the way we've always done it. We don't have to do it the way lawyers and judges do it. There are other ways to kind of look at things. So that's just my comment. I do have a couple of questions that I'd like to share. So one person says, I'm a credentialed member of 2 different denominations, and they handle clergy who have committed sexual abuse very differently. One deals with them confidentially when the clergy face a committee and learn the consequences of their actions. The other sends out a letter to all clergy about the behavior of the clergy and the decision of the committee that met with them. What are your reactions to those 2 different approaches?
Could you say them again, the 2 different approaches?
Yes. So one of them is, one deals with them confidentially when the clergy faces a committee and learn the consequences. And then the other sends out a letter to everybody saying what happened. So I know where I stand, but
I don't know that I like either of them myself. I think dealing with a survivor, the issue of confidentiality should be with the survivor. As we said earlier, Jim said so well, what does a survivor want or need? And if a survivor needs confidentiality, then they need to be granted that. And if not, I think you come to an agreement around that. And I don't understand the letter. So writing a letter about all that transpired, I don't.
Okay, so the names of the abused are never included in this. So basically, the clergy is, it's either treated confidentially and nobody knows what happened, or the congregation and other clergy are told what happened and the outcome. So there's a certain level of transparency there.
I do think that the predators' names need to be released, and have been in many dioceses, and still many have not. And the stories need to be told.
Yeah, I mean, I know that one of the things that the Southern Baptist survivor group is calling for is a database of offenders, because, you know, like in the Catholic Church, people move around and none of the incidents follow them. You know, they just kind of disappear into the next congregation. So, Jem, any thoughts on this?
Well, I'm intrigued by the way the two poles are framed. I wish it was that black and white. In my experience, it's not that black and white. That word gets out one way or the other. And I think one of the things that is difficult is the more you move toward the side that says do not disclose, the more you reinforce the kind of culture and the kind of patterns which create a breeding ground for that kind of behavior in the first place. If you honor the truth, you start looking at not only who did what, but how did this come to pass? It gives you the opportunity to say, let's analyze what happened. What can we learn from this experience that we can take forward? What can we do preventively the next time? What role did the particular religious body play or not play in either preventing or intervening upon discovery? I would rather err on the side of truth and then focus the question is, how do we go about this? What are the needs of individuals at the particular time? Some survivors absolutely do not want to be dragged into some kind of public disclosure. On the other hand, there are also those who would be absolutely outraged if the truth is not told and are willing to stand up and have their identity disclosed so that the secrets are not kept.
Yeah.
I don't want to say it's entirely situational, but these are complex situations. But I will always err on the side of truth because it furthers the end of justice and I think recovery, not only for the individual, but also for the sake of the congregation. And in the long run, I'd rather that offender face the truth in a way that helps promote that person's repentance.
Yeah.
I agree, and I believe you do need to release the name of the perpetrator, and you could still tell a story and keep the survivor's name anonymous.
Yeah.
But the stories have to be told, because in the story there is truth, and we have to know the stories to understand how something happened so it will never happen again. Without addressing that piece, it's the elephant in the room, and things will not move forward. So I'm one who wants my story told, and I feel power in that. And Jim is right. There are some other survivors that don't. So honoring the survivor is paramount in my way of thinking. And then, of course, the truth. Without knowing the truth of things, we're in darkness and we can't move to light. So I think we're in agreement.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I think that often the issue of confidentiality is basically used as a cover to not have to,
Yeah.
tell the truth about what happened, and hold people accountable. Because again, like you were saying, Mary, with clericalism, like it's really hard to hold your friend Bob accountable.
Yeah.
So,
And the word gets out. Jesus says, if the disciples are silent, the stones will cry out. I think confidentiality is highly overrated in congregations. People talk.
yeah.
The word bleeds out.
Mhm. That, I
So,
think that's the real stumbling block, why we're in such a predicament, the silence, the secrecy, and the imposed shame around it all.
so given the number of survivors who are speaking out, do you feel like shame is lessening? Do you feel like people are finding or
Well,
recognizing that they're not?
I think with every time a survivor tells a story, there is less shame. It's the silence and the secrecy that keeps us living in a shameful place. And every time I and survivors I have talked to tell their story, a little more of the darkness opens and a little more light. But I wanted to add, with my work with survivors of nun abuse, shame is a great big piece of it, and all abuse, but so many men who were abused by nuns carry great shame because they either believe it was their fault, they were a man, they were a boy, they should have been strong. And to this day, there's shame. But I know what has helped all of us is telling our stories to especially each other and hearing their stories and how they move forward. And as I said, with each telling, shame diminishes it. But living in shame is a very terrible place. I lived in shame in my own life for a long time. It took me till age 52 to finally, I say, let this little egg crack open and get a little bit of light, then a little bit more and a little bit more, till I came to terms with the fact that I indeed was raped by a priest. So it was shame that kept me, and denial, of course. And with my nun abuse, I'm 79 now, and I just came to terms with that. So I believe shame is a debilitating factor. And the more we can talk about our lives, our stories, telling the truth, the more the shame diminishes. It's like, oh, I'm not alone. I had a call from a survivor, an email message, and all it said is, the only thing I want to know is, am I the only one? And that just boom,
It's
boom, boom,
heartbreaking.
right to my heart.
Yeah.
And I, of course, wrote back, no, you are not the only one. But living in that shame and aloneness is debilitating, devastating.
Absolutely. And, Jim talked about trauma-informed awareness. I think that the more that we understand how trauma impacts people, their health, their behavior, that also, I think, can be very healing. Recognizing that the impact of trauma is really lifelong, and is not,
Yeah.
So it looks like we're just about out of time. Do either of you have any kind of wrap-up words that you'd like to throw out here? I do want to say that someone asked for the 4 different kinds of truth that Jim was talking about, and I will include those in the follow-up email. So don't worry, you'll get those.
Well, I would just like to thank you both and the listeners for calling in. I'd like to tell survivors, no, you are not alone, and encourage you on your healing journeys, and churches to do the same.
Thank you.
Amen.
Okay. Well, I want to thank you both for being here and for sharing your experience and expertise with us. And it would be wonderful to do this again. So I think it was a really valuable conversation. Thank you both so much for being here.
Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Take care, everybody. We'll
Bye.
see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.